It's really great to be here. I have a quick question. Any other technical writers in the house? Any documentation team? I see some hands. You're going to like this. Do you remember this sound? That was the sound of software documentation being delivered a couple of years ago. The louder that sound, the happier your program teams were. And I can see all the docs people nodding. The problem was we started to ask ourselves, does just making a large book of documentation make the lives of our users better? Does this improve our development cycles? Is this even being read? Is the cost of making this book effective? Well, the interesting thing we learned was no. What we learned was that technical writers are being forced to use tools they hate to create software documentation that customers were no longer reading. Any developers in the crowd? Yeah, we've got you too. So what's interesting is we hear the same thing over and over and over every single year. In this case, we have a Stack Overflow survey. This year, the same as last year, over 80% of developers cite that they learn how to code through official documentation. And of course, we hear that over 34% of them, 1/3 of the total global population of developers in the world, complaining that documentation is incomplete or that it sucks. Let's move to GitHub. Again, over and over and over again, we see the same survey every year. Over 93%, nearly 100%, give or take, of developers are complaining about documentation. So this is a problem through whatever lens you look at it. Technical writers are unhappy. Developers are unhappy. Customers are unhappy. That's the problem. So here's the solution. It's called Corilla. We make collaborative documentation for software teams. What's kind of interesting about what we do is that we're looking at it through 3 lenses. One is that we build an environment to write and collaborate. So think of your Google Doc experience, your Etherpad experience for those of us in open source. We look at it as a way to manage our content. We think of it as putting the M back into CMS. And then we look at how can we also bundle a publishing experience. Why are we getting our technical writers to learn how to code? Now, I love Git and I love Jekyll, but if you've ever managed a team of technical writers, you know that it's a waste of time getting to learn how to code on a command line simply to write and publish documents. So let's do a run through. Let's have a look at this. This is Corilla. So we're going to do an awesome workflow here. This is the view where we can see all of our existing content. Think of it as like your Google Docs view or a file server. We're going to make a new piece of documentation. It's teaching my team how to use Trello for our roadmap. Now, once we've made this, you're familiar with these kind of editors. You write your markdown on the left, and you see the real-time render on the right. Check this out, though. As technical writers, we do a lot of documentation screenshots. So we're just going to do a screenshot simply right there. And what I love about this, the technical writers, you're going to love this, is we simply copy and paste it directly into the editor. It gets uploaded to a version-controlled file server, and there it is. If you've ever done a screenshot, we've just saved you about 5 to 10 minutes and 300 cursors. Next, we just save it. It's version controlled. We push a commit message, and there it is. We can see we have full version control and revision history inside the tool. Next, we have something that you're going to love. It's called collections. Instead of saving your files in separate folders or separate repos, there's one repo. On the left, you have all the existing content. On the right is the table of contents of the documentation or the package you're creating. Think of it as these books that we used to do. In our case, you create your documentation, you just drag and drop the topics that you want to put inside of this collection. What I love about this in managing teams, we can see where that collection's been published, how many people have read it, full analytics suite behind it, and the coolest bit, with one click, forget Jekyll. This is real time, so in about 3 seconds, we've live published all of that documentation suite directly to Corilla's onboard knowledge base and documentation portal. Oh yeah, and you can see that we were on Product Hunt recently. So let's actually take a step back to appreciate what we've just done. We've got 3 elements here. We've got a writing interface that lets your teams, distributed globally, come together and write in the single instance together. We've got a full management platform that allows your team to come together and put the M back into CMS. It gives you a way to take your existing content, search for it, reuse it, and make the best value of the content you've already paid to create. And we've got an inbuilt publishing platform. You can export it via our APIs to any format or any destination you want, or use our internal documentation portal. Now, this is kind of cool, because this isn't the first time we've done this. Any Red Hatters in the room? None? They're all having the free lunch. So I used to work for a company called Red Hat, and this is like family to us. And while at Red Hat, we created something called PressGang. We thought of it as an internal startup. We're solving our own challenge of how can we, as a distributed team, more efficiently and more effectively create software documentation and collaborate with the developers. Whilst doing that, we took over about 2/3 of Red Hat's global software documentation teams in our first year, and we started to get feedback from the external community that this is great, but it's very hard for our teams to let us to install software documentation tools on our server. Can you just maybe let us use a credit card? Can we have a SaaS product? So we joined a startup accelerator in Paris, France called Numa as a part of the Techstars family. And in that experience, we learned that there was a massive shift happening in our industry. We're no longer using XML file formats. We're moving to Markdown. We're no longer making things via command line and compiling laborious, and if there's any Red Hat crew from my old team, laborious methods of shipping documentation. So we're a SaaS company. We listened to our customers. We went through the process of leaving Red Hat, becoming a startup, doing all the hard things of learning how to get up on our feet, and we came up with this model. So we have a monthly model for 3 sets of teams. At the $25 a month range, this enables small to medium teams to basically use that workflow that we introduced. About $45 a month, we introduced custom domains, custom branding, all the things that a medium to large size team would use, and $95 and upwards is when we tackle the enterprise market. So we tackled this in 3 phases. Initially, the phase 1 was to target where our expertise was. What other technical writers, what other teams out there like our team at Red Hat existed? And this is a space that we're quite well known within, we have a lot of experience within. We moved into phase 2 recently. We shipped our MVP. We started to onboard customers. And we're noticing something very interesting, so interesting that I've relocated from Australia and now live in the San Francisco Bay Area just to see this thing happening time and time again, that our existing users, when we meet them, bring their marketing teams and their developer advocacy teams in to say, we're using this product too, can you show us, can you add these new features? Phase 3 will be very interesting for us, how to increase our ACV, how can we increase the revenue from our existing customers by getting larger in the enterprise realm, what they call land and expand. So in terms of traction, we have over 1,000 teams in over 80 countries currently using Corilla. A team can vary between 2 people on an open source project, and I should add, open source is free for life, so please jump in. And those teams can also go up to, you name it, any number. What's also kind of fun, if anyone here knows Product Hunt, we were surprised by our servers getting absolutely smashed not too long ago, and we had to do the all-night Product Hunt thing. And I was very surprised for a documentation product to realize that we're actually one of the most popular products that day. So we made the short list of hot products, which again, for a documentation product is pretty surprising. In terms of a team, as you might imagine, there's a whole heap of us ex-Red Hatters in there. We love the support we have from our community. We've decided to refocus our attitude rather than just being a bunch of technical writers. We've become very heavily obsessive about UX and UI. Think of us as like what Trello was to Jira, we are to Confluence. And that is Corilla, collaborative documentation for software teams. Jump on corilla.com today and I'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you.
So thank you, great presentation. So I guess you used to be Paul Games' team, right?
Yeah,
way back when. So quick question, of the 12,000 people, teams that you referred to earlier that's using your product, how big is the biggest team?
We've had a team of 60. Just for sake of not being too public with some of the names, we had a large team that has something to do with rocket ships that jumped in. We learned at the time that we weren't capable to serve that larger user base. So we started to move back down market into the smaller software teams that you might find around the Bay Area in the startup space.
Gotcha. How many paid customers do you have?
Interesting. So we launched the various pricing. So we used a series of tests to split test different pricing friction. And on the site, we've always displayed certain pricing variations. And usually how we get our high NPS is I usually jump in the trial period and we roll them across onto freemium. What we have done is we've really surprised that some of the teams, especially in San Francisco, demanded that they keep paying because they managed to convince their boss to pull a credit card out. So we have around 20 paying customers in various spaces. And for a freemium company, we found that interesting because we were saying this is actually free. We'd like you to use this. But we're very surprised that people actually wanted to keep the credit card rolling.
That's great. And then the final question is, of your 12,000 teams, I bet some of them probably use it for a period of time and then just leave it behind as shelfware. What caused that?
Yeah, that's really been interesting. We had to struggle with this at first. We were very strict with our monthly active users. Then we found out that that wasn't such a bad thing. Teams would come in before a software release cycle, similar to what we used to do at Red Hat, once or twice a year. There'd be a big burst of activity. We'd get a lot of support requests. Then they'd ship their documentation, then go idle. So we were worrying about our monthly active users and obsessing because obviously being in the Bay, we wanted to speak to VCs eventually and have great numbers. Then realized what a boon it was to actually have this spike in these trends. So the challenge became more about, instead of just addressing churn, was addressing additional value and saying, is there value for you to keep active in this or should we just leave you alone? Which is one of the interesting challenges as we come out of the MVP and think, is it actually useful to keep you collaborating and active, or is this enough that you've actually published your content and you're satisfied?
I didn't quite understand your pricing slide, but you're definitely not charging enough. That I'm sure of. I wanted to talk a little bit about how you see the competitive landscape, because I imagine a lot of people are building stuff in-house. A lot of people are turning to a more traditional, less documentation-centric CMS tools. You had that really neat trick with a quick screenshot, and I'm sure there's some great stuff for code snippets. Walk me through what you see as that sort of wedge of differentiation that's highly relevant to the documentation staff, and then help me understand, particularly as you go to software teams or marketing teams with the platform, how relevant that stuff is.
That's a great question. It's actually some of my favorite areas, our biggest learnings. So the greatest sense of value is something that we experienced at Red Hat. So we were shipping something called EAP6. We were refactoring the entire product. Our team was spread around the world, so we needed a way to have all of our writers using the one interface, and in fact, not just different versions, but the exact same live experience, and give them a way to publish through that. What we found interesting in that process was other teams started to move in. Say the marketing teams would see the way we version control, and having all your marketing assets version controlled was not a planned instance in the beginning. As that started to roll out, we realized there's a larger collaborative play in there. In terms of pricing, was that your first part? Pricing has been really interesting. We're definitely coming in under market, which for a bootstrap team with a little bit of angel has been quite an interesting prospect. But in terms of competition, again, being in the Bay Area, we had something funny happen where I was sitting with the team and they brought their developer in. And the developer actually had built his own instance using Gitbooks, using Jekyll. And while we're sitting there talking, I just asked one question. It was a little bit rude. I said, "Can you tell me what's your wage?" And his wage was about 160,000 US.
Cheap for the Bay Area.
Cheap for the Bay Area, exactly. And I couldn't help but ask and say, "Can you tell me how many hours a week you think you're actually configuring this documentation portal, that the things we've bundled for $45 a month, if it's more than 1 hour a week, then why not just move to a SaaS provider like this?" And that's actually become our sales pitch as we come in, and we're quite well known just in that first go-to-market segment where people say, "Look, we're tired of doing this ourselves. We like doing it. Devs love making dev tools." But the problem is saying, well, that's very expensive, especially in the US.
Great, thanks.
No worries.
What happens when a customer stops paying? Is it like Apple Music where it goes away? Anything you've downloaded, and because it seems like they own that. I mean, that's their.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
You know, the trick about that question is now people know, because we've actually debated this a lot, is what do we do? And there's as UX designers, we're very big on patterns. What are the usability patterns that exist? And we chose to be as generous as possible. So as how we got over those 1,000 teams, some teams came in and wanted to churn away, even from freemium or some of the early paying ones. And we basically said, well, your documentation will stay because your docs has the powered by Corilla down the bottom. So that actually has a marketing value for us for the time being. And I think looking at something like the Slack model, where if a user is inactive on Slack, they pro-rata the cost back to you. And we thought that's how we want to typify our company. We come from Red Hat, there's a certain culture we represent, and as long as that we can pay our bills, and we're talking the majority of our bills are storage, which is a race to the bottom these days with Amazon and Google Cloud, that we decided actually let's make our point of difference customer service and obsess about making sure that experience is joyous. So if you use Corilla for a while, you pay for a few months and you churn off, your documentation will remain there, at least for the time being.
So if the core value proposition is around technical publication and documentation of software, what's that? I mean, I can understand how making that easier is intuitive, right? But what's the value of that market today? What is the market that you've chosen spending on that? And you know, what does that say about your opportunity? If you're X% cheaper than the leader today, given that you're doing aggressive pricing in a freemium model, what's that leave for you to take advantage of?
That question used to keep me awake every single night during our accelerator program. It was a really good one. What we felt was in the first phase of the company, building the MVP, getting the prototype up and running, and getting some paying customers to prove the validation. We felt that in this phase, we would learn the insights that would let us tackle the next step. And thankfully, that happened. So when we started to sit down and I'd have lunch with the team, say, I basically live in South Park and all our customers are sitting around there, and we'd have lunch with them and the marketing team would run up and say, "Hey, can you show us how your images are so easy to copy and paste? That saves us like literally an hour a week." And we started thinking, okay, this is interesting. The opportunity is there. So as I say, the phase one is just maximizing the narrow niche that we have. We thought we want to focus on an area that there's very few teams that have the expertise we have as technical writers. We're seeing some companies, our competitors, only focus on that space, where I'm seeing like a T action happening. The land and expand is once we're in there, we're seeing developer advocacy teams growing. Now, I like that one as a far greater total addressable market, because the number one thing growing in the universe right now is the total headcount of developers. And as I said, if 80% of those complain that 80% are forced to use documentation to learn how to code, and that's the number one growing thing, then that's definitely a good space to be in front of. And if we can improve the ability for them to learn, to create documentation together, then that itself is that serviceable market becomes tangible. Then as we go up market to enterprise, now startups are meant to be a little bit of bravado. I like to be realistic. At that phase, we know as we learn phase two, we'll learn enterprise after that. We don't want to promise the world in this space, but we're very confident as we move out of the technical writing space that we know enough about that growth pattern that expands organically that we really want to dominate the land and expand.
Last question.
I'll just make a comment. If you're at the point where you are securing revenue and you also have investors, it seems like if someone stops paying, there ought to be some pain. I mean, they can have the data, but maybe find something that that they want so that they keep paying from a retention standpoint and you don't lose
Absolutely.
customer.
If I can just a quick comment on that. We do think very heavily about stickiness. What we've seen is the existing products, the NPS ratings are terrible. So there's two markets happening here. There's the existing, I'm sorry if anyone's from Adobe, I'm about to rubbish your product, FrameMaker. I can say publicly, it's terrible. As a technical writer, I've been forced to use that my whole life. NPS is in the rubbish bin. So when you see people like us and some of the other startups coming through in our space, we're all motivated by the experience and the UX. And as we start to bolt on analytics, grammar checkers, collaboration tools, machine learning to analyze patterns in your publishing, those things become sticky. And I'd rather bind us to our roadmap and our ability to ship things that make lives better than to lock you in Oracle-esque and say, screw you, you have to pay or we kill your docs. I want to be in that business, not that business.
I'm not saying that extreme, but something if you have investors, because they want a return at some point, likely.
Absolutely.
If you stay and bootstrap it on your own, you can do whatever you want. Okay.
The investor conversation is one we can have offline because it's a very interesting space, but thank you for your feedback.
All right, David, thank you very much.